On the night of April 14 to the 15th of April 1912, in the icy waters of the North Atlantic, a ship disappeared that was believed to be impossible to sink. It was called the Pinnacle of Engineering. It was built by the best specialists of its time. Its hull was divided into 16 watertight compartments. Newspapers wrote that it was practically unsinkable. And yet, only 4 days after leaving England, this giant ended up at the bottom of the ocean. The official version is known to everyone. An iceberg. A random catastrophe. A tragic mistake. The story seems simple, but the more closely you look at the details of that night, the more strange things begin to appear, because some of the crew's decisions seem unexpected. Some warnings were received long before the collision, and some details of this story sound as if they should not have existed at all. But wait, because there is one thing worth starting with. A man connected to this ship was supposed to be on board during the maiden voyage. His cabin was prepared, his luggage was loaded, his name was on the passenger list, but at the very last moment, he canceled the trip. A few days later, the Titanic disappeared into the ocean together with more than 1,500 people. A coincidence? Maybe, but the deeper we examine this catastrophe, the more often we encounter decisions that make you stop and ask again. Why did everything happen exactly this way? Why was the ship traveling almost at maximum speed in an area full of icebergs? Why did some warnings not lead to a change of course? Why did the lookouts notice the iceberg so late? And why did they not have the instrument that could have helped them see it earlier? But this is only the beginning, because the story of the Titanic is not just the story of an iceberg. It is the story of a chain of decisions, strange coincidences, and questions that even after more than 100 years still do not have final answers. And before we reach the end of this story, we will have to ask one very uncomfortable question. What if the Titanic sank, not only because of the iceberg? Now let's set emotions aside for a moment and look at the Titanic disaster as an engineering problem. No legends, no romance, only numbers. Because sometimes it is the numbers that begin to ask the most uncomfortable questions. The Titanic was one of the largest moving objects of its time. Its length was about 269 meters. Its displacement was more than 46,000 tons. That is the mass of a small city moving across the water at a speed of about 22 knots, around 40 kilometers per hour. For passengers on deck, it felt like calm movement. But for physics, it was enormous inertia. And this is where the first problem appears. When an object of that mass moves at that speed, it is impossible to stop it instantly. But wait, because the official version claims that the crew had enough time to try to avoid the collision. Let's calculate. According to reconstructions of the events, the iceberg was spotted at about 2340. The distance to it was approximately 400 to 500 meters. It sounds like a safe distance, but if we convert Titanic's speed into seconds, an interesting number appears. The ship was traveling about 11 meters every second. This means that 400 meters turn into roughly 36 seconds. 36 seconds. In that time, the iceberg had to be spotted, the warning sent to the bridge, a decision made, the rudder turned, and the course of a ship almost 3 football fields long changed. But here, the real problem begins. A ship of that size does not turn instantly. Even if the rudder is turned immediately, the enormous mass continues moving forward by inertia. Engineers later calculated that the turning radius of the Titanic was enormous. In fact, the ship began responding to the maneuver only after several seconds, and this is where the first uncomfortable question appears. Even with a perfect reaction from the crew, there simply might not have been enough time. But wait, because the strangest part of this story begins even earlier. Several hours before the collision, the Titanic received multiple warnings about icebergs from other ships. Some of those messages spoke about large ice fields directly along the route. In other words, the crew knew. And this is where the second question appears. If there were icebergs ahead, why did the ship continue moving at almost maximum speed? This is especially strange because many captains at that time would slow down at night in similar conditions. Darkness, ice, freezing water. But Titanic continued moving forward almost as fast as during the day. Why? Some historians explain this by the confidence in the ship's design. Titanic was considered practically unsinkable. Its hull was divided into 16 watertight compartments. Even if several of them were damaged, the ship was supposed to remain afloat. But here another problem appears. Because confidence in unsinkability can lead to a dangerous effect. People begin to feel too safe, and that, perhaps, played a role that night. But there is another detail that makes this story even stranger. When the lookouts finally spotted the iceberg, they did not have the instrument that could have helped them see it earlier. And this detail sounds almost unbelievable. There were no binoculars in the crow's nest. At first glance, this sounds like a small detail, something easy to overlook. But sometimes, it is exactly these small details that begin to change the entire picture of events. Because on the night of the collision, the lookouts in the mast of the Titanic were performing one of the most important jobs on the ship. Their task was simple and at the same time critically important to watch ahead and be the first to notice any obstacles in the ship's path. Icebergs, ice fields, other vessels, anything that could represent danger. But this is where something strange begins. When the surviving lookouts later gave their testimony, an unexpected detail became clear. They did not have binoculars. Wait a moment. On the largest passenger ship in the world, crossing the North Atlantic, the lookouts at night were watching ahead without binoculars. And this is not a rumor and not a later theory. It is a confirmed fact from the official investigation. Lookout Frederick Fleet later stated directly that having binoculars could have helped them notice the iceberg earlier, perhaps a few minutes earlier. And under the conditions of that night, even a single minute could have changed everything. But then the next question appears. Why were there no binoculars? Because on most ships of that time, lookouts did use binoculars. It was standard equipment, especially at night or in conditions of poor visibility. But on the Titanic, they were locked inside a cabinet. And here, the story becomes even stranger. The key to the cabinet, with the binoculars, belonged to an officer named David Blair. He was supposed to serve on the Titanic during its maiden voyage. But just before the ship departed, he was unexpectedly removed from the crew and replaced by another officer. This happened only a few hours before departure. In the rush, he left the ship and took the key with him. The binoculars remained locked away. The lookouts went to sea without one of their main tools. A coincidence? Perhaps. But let's think about what this meant in practice. The night was extremely dark. The moon barely illuminated the water. The air temperature was close to freezing. The sea was unusually calm. So calm that waves were not breaking against the base of the icebergs. Normally, it is the white foam around the ice that helps sailors notice it from a distance. But that night it did not exist. The icebergs were almost invisible. Now imagine a lookout about 30 meters above the water. He is staring forward into the darkness. The wind is cold, the water is black, the horizon is barely visible, and he has no binoculars. He can only see the iceberg when its dark silhouette finally begins to stand out against the sky. That means one thing. The detection distance becomes much shorter. But wait, because here, another important question appears. Even if binoculars could have helped them see the iceberg a little earlier, would it have changed the outcome of the disaster? To understand that, we need to return to the numbers from the previous block. Remember the 36 seconds? Even if the iceberg had been spotted 1 minute earlier, the crew would have had about 90 seconds instead of 36. That is still extremely little time for a ship almost 270 meters long, but it is already a chance. And here, a new thought appears. Sometimes disasters do not happen because of a single mistake. They happen because of a chain of small coincidences. The absence of binoculars, high speed, a dark night, a calm sea, the late detection of the iceberg. Each of these details alone does not seem fatal, but together they create a situation where the probability of error begins to rise. And yet the story becomes even stranger, because the absence of binoculars is only one of the details of that night. There is another factor that is rarely discussed, but that could have made the iceberg almost invisible, even to an attentive observer. And this factor is not connected to the ship. It is connected to the atmosphere. Because that night above the Atlantic, there was a rare optical phenomenon that may have literally hidden the iceberg until the very last minute. When we imagine the Titanic disaster, a simple picture usually appears. A massive iceberg brightly illuminated by the stars, and a ship that simply did not have enough time to turn. But the more researchers studied the conditions of that night, the more strange details began to appear. Because some survivors said the same thing. The iceberg seemed to appear out of nowhere. The lookouts noticed it only when it was already directly in front of the ship. And this is where another factor appears, one that is rarely discussed: the atmosphere. On the night of the disaster in the North Atlantic, what is known as a temperature inversion may have been occurring. This is a rare atmospheric phenomenon in which cold air lies close to the surface of the water, while a warmer layer of air sits above it. At first glance, this sounds like ordinary meteorology. But this phenomenon has a strange optical effect. It can distort the horizon. Light begins to bend in unusual ways. Objects in the distance can appear lower, higher, or even disappear entirely. Sometimes this effect creates something similar to a mirage. But wait, because if such an inversion really occurred that night, it could have changed the visibility of the iceberg. Its silhouette could have literally blended into the horizon. For a lookout in the crow's nest, this meant the iceberg might only become visible at the very last moment, when the ship was already too close. Some modern researchers have attempted to reconstruct the atmospheric conditions of that night. They analyzed survivor testimonies, data about air and water temperatures, and reports from other ships that were in the same area. And the results were interesting. Several vessels that night reported unusual optical effects on the horizon. Light appeared distorted. The waterline looked strange. In some places, objects seemed farther away than they actually were. But here, another problem appears. Even if the iceberg was difficult to see, the crew still knew that there were ice fields ahead. Radio warnings arrived throughout the day. Some ships reported large icebergs directly along Titanic's route. And this brings us back to the previous question. Why was the speed not reduced? Because when captains knew there was ice ahead, they usually made one of two decisions. Either they slowed down, or they changed course further south to avoid the ice field. But Titanic continued moving forward at almost the same speed. This decision becomes even more strange when we consider the size of the ship. Enormous mass, enormous inertia, an enormous turning radius, and yet the speed remained high. Why? Some historians believe the crew was confident in the ship's capabilities. Titanic was considered a technological miracle of its time. Its watertight compartments were supposed to protect the vessel even in the case of serious damage. But here another important point appears. Because the design of these compartments had one feature that passengers hardly knew about, and this feature ultimately played a decisive role in the fate of the ship. The bulkheads between the compartments did not extend all the way up to the upper deck. This means that if water began filling several compartments in a row, it could simply spill over into the next ones, like water flowing over steps. And that is exactly what happened after the collision. But wait, because the most important detail of this story is not only how the ship was built, it is how exactly it collided with the iceberg. Because there is one calculation that sounds almost unbelievable. If Titanic had not tried to turn, and had struck the iceberg head-on, the ship might not have sunk at all. When the lookouts finally shouted the famous words, "Iceberg right ahead," seconds began on the bridge that would determine the fate of the entire ship. The signal came at approximately 23:40. The officer on duty immediately ordered the helm to turn and the course to be changed. The engines began shifting into maneuvering mode. It looked like the correct reaction. Any captain's instinct would be to try to avoid the obstacle. But this is where one of the most paradoxical moments in the entire story of the Titanic begins. Because from an engineering perspective, that very maneuver may have been what doomed the ship. But wait, because if we look carefully at the structure of the hull, something becomes clear. Titanic was designed to survive damage to several compartments, but only under a certain type of impact. If the ship had collided with the iceberg head-on, the damage would have been concentrated in one area. Perhaps one or two of the forward compartments would have taken the blow. The ship would have suffered serious damage but remained afloat. Modern reconstructions support this possibility. The enormous hull could likely have survived a frontal collision, even with heavy destruction. But when the ship began to turn, something very different happened. The iceberg scraped along the side of the ship like a giant knife. It did not punch one large hole. Instead, it left a series of openings along the hull. Several compartments began filling with water at the same time. And this is where the design of the unsinkable ship began to work against it. The watertight compartments could indeed contain flooding, but only if 4 or fewer were damaged. After the collision, 6 compartments were breached. That was the critical limit. The ship began slowly tilting forward. At first, it was almost unnoticeable. Passengers felt only a slight vibration. Many did not even realize that anything had happened, but the engineers on board quickly understood the situation. As water filled the forward compartments, the bow of the ship began to sink lower. And then something happened that most passengers had never even imagined. Water began spilling over the tops of the bulkheads into the next compartments. Imagine a row of glasses standing on steps. When the first one overflows, the water begins to pour into the next, then into the next, and stopping the process becomes impossible. But wait, because this leads to one of the most debated questions of the entire disaster. Why did the crew choose the evasive maneuver? Because at first glance, it seems like the obvious decision. But if the ship had struck the iceberg directly with its bow, the consequences might have been very different. Some modern engineers believe the ship might have remained afloat. There may still have been casualties. The front of the ship might have been severely damaged, but the Titanic itself likely would not have sunk. And here, a strange paradox appears. The attempt to avoid the collision may have made the disaster far worse. But even after that moment, the people on board still had time. Nearly 3 hours passed between the collision and the final sinking of the ship. 3 hours. It sounds like a long time. Enough time to evacuate passengers. Enough time to launch lifeboats. Enough time to save most of the people on board. But this is where another detail appears that makes the story even more disturbing. Because on board the Titanic, there were not enough lifeboats for everyone. Now another detail appears that at first glance looks like a simple tragic mistake. On board the Titanic, there were about 2,200 people, passengers and crew, but there were only 20 lifeboats, and those boats could carry about 1,178 people. That means that even if every boat had been filled to its absolute limit, more than 1,000 people would still have remained on the ship. This fact is known to many, but almost no one asks the next question. Why did the largest ship of its time sail into the ocean with lifeboats for only half of the people on board? Because Titanic was not an old vessel. It was the newest technological project of its era. It had been built over several years. It had been inspected by engineers, inspectors, and maritime authorities. And yet this ship sailed across the Atlantic with a rescue system that from the beginning could not save every passenger. But wait, because this is where the strangest part of the story begins. The issue was not simply that there were too few lifeboats. The issue was that there could have been many more. The design of the deck allowed space for up to 64 lifeboats. 64. That would have been enough for almost everyone on board. But only 20 were installed. Why? The official explanation sounds like this. Maritime regulations at the time did not require more boats. The law calculated the number of lifeboats, not by the number of passengers, but by the tonnage of the ship. And the regulations simply had not been updated for the new generation of giant ocean liners. But that explanation begins to look strange if we examine it more closely, because the engineers who designed Titanic perfectly understood the size of the ship. They knew how many people would be on board. They knew how many lifeboats might be needed in the worst-case scenario. And yet they chose to install only part of the possible number. Why? Some historians say that additional lifeboats might have ruined the appearance of the ship. Titanic was meant to look luxurious. The wide promenade deck was part of the liner's image. Extra lifeboats could have blocked the ocean view for first-class passengers. But if that is true, an even more uncomfortable question appears. Was aesthetics considered more important than safety? But wait, because the problem with the lifeboats turned out to be even deeper. Even the boats that were on board were launched in the first hours, far from fully filled. Some were lowered into the water with only half of their possible passengers, sometimes even with a third. For example, one of the first lifeboats could carry about 65 people, but only 28 boarded it. 28. This was happening at a moment when more than 2,000 people were still on the ship. Why did this happen? Because at first, Many passengers simply did not believe that the ship was actually sinking. Music continued to play. The lights on the decks were still on. The ship was moving downward almost imperceptibly. For many people, it looked like an ordinary technical stop. But there is another detail that makes the story even more disturbing. When the first lifeboats began moving away from the ship, there were still huge numbers of people standing on the decks. And at that moment, the officers began making decisions about who would board the boats first: women and children. That rule became famous, but it had unexpected consequences. Because on some decks, there simply were not enough women and children near the boats. Men were initially not allowed to board, and the boats left half empty. But here, another question appears. Even if there were not enough lifeboats, even if the evacuation was chaotic, why did help not arrive sooner? Because that night, another ship was not far from the Titanic, and its lights could be seen from the deck. People on Titanic even tried to signal it with rockets, but that ship never came. And this detail, decades later, became one of the most mysterious parts of the entire disaster. When Titanic had already begun slowly lowering its bow into the water, many passengers on deck noticed something strange. On the horizon, there were the lights of another ship. It was not a distant point of light. Witnesses later said the lights looked fairly close. Close enough that it seemed help could arrive at any moment. People on deck even began pointing in that direction. The officers on the bridge could see those lights as well. And this is where one of the most mysterious parts of the entire disaster begins, because Titanic began sending signals. First with rockets, signal flares. White rockets rose into the sky one after another. This was an international distress signal. Any ship that saw such rockets was supposed to understand that somewhere nearby a catastrophe was unfolding. But wait, because the ship on the horizon did not move closer. It remained where it was, as if it were watching from a distance. Witnesses on Titanic said the rockets were fired again and again. Some passengers even tried to send signals using lanterns, but there was no response. And here the first question appears. If another ship was so close, why did it not come to help? Because the distance between the ships may have been only a few miles. For a steamship of that era, that meant roughly an hour of travel. And Titanic had nearly 3 hours before it fully sank. In theory, that was enough time to save hundreds of people, but help never came. And even at the time, this seemed strange. When the official investigation began, investigators tried to determine which ship had been nearby. Gradually, a possible answer appeared. The vessel might have been a ship called the Californian. It was a cargo ship that night had stopped near a field of ice. Its captain decided to halt because of the danger posed by the ice. The ship drifted in the darkness, waiting for daylight. But here, another strange detail appears. The radio operator of the Californian had already gone to sleep that evening. The radio station had been turned off. That meant the ship could not receive the SOS signal that Titanic was transmitting. But wait, because the distress signals were not only radio messages, there were also rockets. And they were seen. Several members of the Californian's crew did notice rockets on the horizon. They reported them to the captain. But here, the testimonies begin to diverge. Some officers said the rockets looked unusual. They were not red, which was the standard distress signal. They were white. Because of this, the captain reportedly concluded that it was not a distress signal, but ordinary signal rockets. Perhaps another ship was simply reporting its position. But let's stop for a moment and think. Night. An ice field. In the distance, an unknown ship is launching rockets, one after another. And yet no one decided to investigate what was happening. That decision later became one of the most controversial in the entire history of the Titanic disaster. Because if the Californian truly had been that close, its intervention might have changed everything. But there is another detail that makes the story even more mysterious. Some witnesses on Titanic claimed that the ship on the horizon looked much closer than the official version suggests. Close enough that they could distinguish its silhouette. And this gave rise to another theory. What if the ship nearby was not the Californian, but another vessel? A ship that, for some reason, was never officially identified. When Titanic had already begun slowly lowering its bow into the water, something strange was noticed on the deck. On the horizon there were lights. The lights of another ship. And this is not a rumor. Dozens of people saw them. Passengers, officers, crew members. People pointed into the darkness and said the same thing. There is a ship. It is close. Close enough that it seemed help could arrive at any minute. But wait, because what happens next still causes debate to this day. Titanic began sending distress signals. Rockets rose into the sky one after another. Bright white flashes illuminated the black Atlantic sky. It was an international signal. A ship is in distress. Any vessel nearby was supposed to come to help. But the ship on the horizon did not move. It simply remained there. Imagine this scene. A massive ocean liner, slowly sinking into the water. People on deck, launching rockets. The lights of another vessel visible on the horizon. And yet no one comes. Why? Later, investigators concluded that the ship was likely the cargo steamer Californian. It really was located in the region of the ice field that night. Its captain had stopped the vessel for the night so as not to risk sailing among the icebergs. But this is where the story becomes strange. The radio operator of the Californian had already gone to sleep. The radio station was turned off. That is why they did not hear the SOS signal. All right. But they did see the rockets. Several members of the Californian's crew actually noticed them on the horizon. They reported it to the captain. And this is where the decision becomes almost impossible to explain. The captain decided to do nothing. He assumed it was not a distress signal, just ordinary rockets. Perhaps another ship was simply signaling its position. But wait, because the rockets were fired again and again. One, then another, and another. Any experienced sailor understands that this is not random. It is a signal. But the ship still did not come closer. And here the question appears that has been debated for more than 100 years. If the Californian was truly that close, why did it not come? Because Titanic had almost 3 hours before it fully sank. 3 hours is an enormous amount of time at sea. In 3 hours, a ship can travel dozens of kilometers. In 3 hours, hundreds of lives can be saved. But help never arrived. And that is why some researchers began asking an even stranger question. What if the ship on the horizon was not the Californian at all? Because some passengers claimed that they saw it much closer, much more clearly. Close enough that it seemed to be only a few miles away. But if that is true, then a new mystery appears. Who was it? And why did that ship disappear from the history of that night? By this point, the story of Titanic already seems like a chain of strange coincidences. High speed in an area full of ice, warnings that did not change the course, the absence of binoculars, a ship on the horizon that never came to help. But there is another version that is almost never mentioned in official films or textbooks, and it sounds so strange that many people laugh when they first hear it. The theory of the ship swap. But wait, because Titanic had an almost identical sister ship, a vessel called Olympic. They were built at the same shipyard, almost at the same time. Their sizes were nearly identical. Their appearance was so similar that an ordinary passenger would not be able to tell them apart from a distance. The length, the funnels, the decks, the placement of the windows, everything looked almost the same. But here, a detail appears that not many people know. A year before the disaster, Olympic had already been involved in a serious accident. It collided with the British naval cruiser Hawke. The damage was significant. The hull suffered a heavy impact. Repairs cost enormous amounts of money, and the insurance company refused to fully cover the losses. The company that owned the ships suddenly found itself in a difficult situation. The repairs were expensive, the ship was damaged, and a brand new liner, Titanic, was just preparing for its first voyage. And here the supporters of this theory ask one question. What if at some point someone decided to switch the ships? Because externally, they were almost indistinguishable. If the damaged Olympic were disguised as Titanic, and the real Titanic continued sailing under the name Olympic, the company could receive a massive insurance payout after a disaster. It sounds like the plot of a movie, but supporters of this idea point to several strange details. Some passengers who had previously sailed on Olympic later said that the interiors of Titanic looked familiar. Too familiar. Other researchers have noted that certain portholes and hull details in photographs do not completely match the original blueprints of Titanic. But wait, because that is not all. A few days before the departure, some shipyard workers reportedly refused to sail on Titanic. According to rumors, they felt that something about the ship was wrong. Of course, proving this is difficult. Many historians consider this story nothing more than a legend, but the ship swap theory has continued to exist for more than 100 years because it tries to explain several things at once: insurance problems, strange decisions, and a catastrophe that happened during the very first voyage. But there is also a serious problem with this theory. If such a swap really happened, hundreds of people would have had to be involved. Engineers, shipyard workers, crew members, inspectors. Too many people for such a secret. And yet the question remains, why did two almost identical giant liners exist at the same time? Why did one of them suffer a serious accident just a year before the disaster? And why, more than a century later, are people still trying to understand what exactly happened that night? But before drawing conclusions, we need to return to the facts. Because even without conspiracy theories, the story of Titanic already contains enough strange decisions. And one of them is connected to a man who was supposed to be on board, but changed his mind at the very last moment. There is one detail in the story of Titanic that appears in almost every investigation, but it is rarely mentioned at the beginning. Usually, it is placed somewhere in the middle of the story, even though, perhaps, it should have been the starting point, because it concerns the man who owned the company that controlled Titanic. His name was John Pierpont Morgan, one of the most powerful financiers of his time, a man who controlled banks, railroads, and a huge portion of the industrial economy of the United States. It was his financial group that stood behind the White Star Line, the company that owned Titanic. And according to the original plan, Morgan was supposed to be on board during the maiden voyage. A luxurious cabin had been prepared for him. His personal belongings had already begun to be loaded onto the ship. Everything was ready. But at the very last moment, he canceled the trip. But wait, because decisions like that are usually made well in advance. Tickets for Titanic's first voyage cost enormous amounts of money, especially the most luxurious cabins. People planned such journeys for months. Yet Morgan canceled the trip almost right before departure. The official explanation sounded simple. He decided to remain in France because of his health. But here, another strange detail appears. A few days later, journalists spotted Morgan walking outside. He appeared completely healthy. There was no sign of a serious illness that would require urgently canceling a transatlantic voyage. A coincidence? Perhaps. Wealthy people often change their plans, but the story becomes more interesting when you look at the list of other passengers, because among those on board Titanic were some of the richest people of that era. Millionaires, financiers, owners of major companies, and several of them died that night. But wait, because there is another theory that sometimes appears in investigations like this. Some of these men were supposedly opposed to the creation of the Federal Reserve System of the United States, a system that was established only a year after the disaster. Supporters of this theory claim that the deaths of several influential financiers may have removed powerful opponents of the new financial system. It sounds like the plot of a political thriller, and most historians treat this idea with strong skepticism, because there is no direct evidence connecting the Titanic disaster with the creation of the Federal Reserve. But the chain of coincidences still makes people ask questions. The richest man connected to the ship cancels his trip at the very last moment. Other influential figures from the financial world remain on board. And only a year after the disaster, one of the most important changes in the financial system of the United States takes place. A coincidence? Perhaps. But the deeper people study the story of Titanic, the more often they encounter coincidences like these. And that is exactly why, more than 100 years later, this catastrophe still sparks debate. Because Titanic is not only the story of a ship, it is the story of decisions, money, technology, and people whose fates crossed during one cold night in the Atlantic Ocean. And before we try to understand what exactly happened that night, we need to look at one more thing: the moment of the collision itself. Because modern research of the wreck revealed a detail that looks very different from what people imagined more than 100 years ago. For more than 100 years, people imagined the Titanic disaster in roughly the same way. A massive iceberg tears a giant hole in the side of the ship. Water immediately begins flooding in. and within a few hours the ship sinks. This image became so firmly fixed in films and books that it feels obvious. But wait. Because when the expedition led by Robert Ballard finally discovered the wreck of Titanic in 1985, at a depth of nearly 4 kilometers, the reality turned out to be very different. When researchers began examining the hull of the ship, they expected to see a massive breach, torn metal, a huge hole stretching along the side. But that was not what they found. Instead, they discovered a series of smaller damages, several long cracks, narrow gaps between the steel plates of the hull. And when engineers began calculating the total area of these openings, the results seemed almost unbelievable. The total area of the holes through which water entered the ship may have been less than 1 square meter, less than the area of an ordinary door. Imagine that for a moment. A ship nearly 270 meters long, a displacement of more than 46,000 tons, and all of it could be destroyed by openings with a combined size roughly equal to a doorway. How is that possible? The answer again lies in the design of the ship. When the iceberg scraped along the side, it did not tear open the hull in one violent impact. Instead, it began pulling out rivets and bending the steel plates. In several places, the hull slightly separated. That was enough for water to begin entering multiple compartments at once. And here the chain reaction appears again. First water enters one compartment, then the second, then the third. The bow of the ship slowly begins to sink lower. And once the angle becomes steep enough, water begins spilling over the tops of the bulkheads into the next compartments, one compartment after another. But wait, because here, another interesting question appears. Why was the hull so vulnerable? After all, Titanic was built from steel, one of the strongest materials of its time. And yet modern studies have shown that the steel used in the hull had a particular characteristic. In very low temperatures, it could become brittle. In the freezing waters of the North Atlantic, the metal could break more easily than under normal conditions. Some researchers even compare the effect to glass. In extreme cold, materials become less flexible and more likely to crack. But there is another detail. The rivets that held the steel plates together were, in some areas, made from lower quality iron. When the iceberg pressed against the side of the ship, these rivets could simply pop out of place, and then small gaps would appear between the plates of the hull, tiny gaps. But there were many of them, and that was enough. But the most surprising thing is something else. The ship did not sink immediately. It remained afloat for nearly 3 hours. 3 hours of struggle between a massive ship and the freezing waters of the Atlantic. And during all that time, the evacuation continued on board. People boarded lifeboats. The musicians continued to play. Officers tried to maintain order. But as time passed, one thing became clearer and clearer. The ship could not be saved. And during those final hours, many stories unfolded. Heroic, tragic, and strange. Stories that turned the sinking of Titanic into one of the most famous disasters in human history. But there is one more moment that still causes debate today. Because when the ship finally disappeared beneath the water, something happened that almost no one expected. As Titanic began sinking deeper into the icy water, many passengers still hoped the ship would somehow remain afloat. At first, the tilt was barely noticeable. The bow slowly lowered. People moved toward the stern. The musicians continued to play. Some passengers did not even realize how serious the situation had become. But wait, because at a certain moment, the ship's struggle with the ocean reached a critical point. When the forward part of the hull filled with water, the weight became so enormous that the entire structure began experiencing tremendous stress. Imagine a ship nearly 300 meters long, where the bow is already being pulled downward by tens of thousands of tons of water, while the stern is still trying to remain on the surface. The middle of the ship suddenly carries a load it was never designed to handle. And this is where a moment occurred that remained a subject of debate for many years. Witnesses in the lifeboats told different stories. Some said the ship went under as one piece. Others claimed they saw it literally break in half. For decades, historians argued about who was right. Because in the darkness, among screams and panic, Eyewitnesses could easily have been mistaken. But wait, because when the wreck was discovered in 1985, this debate finally received an answer. Titanic really did break apart. When the bow sank too deep, the stress on the hull became enormous. The metal began to bend. At some point, the structure simply could not hold any longer. The ship broke roughly near the middle. The bow section immediately began descending toward the bottom of the ocean, and the stern rose above the water for several minutes, almost vertical. Imagine that scene. A gigantic ship, illuminated by the stars, slowly lifting its stern upward like a massive tower of steel. People on the deck trying to hold on. Then the lights go out, and moments later, the enormous structure disappears into the ocean. But wait, because another fact appears here that sounds almost unbelievable. When the stern remained above the surface for those few minutes, theoretically, there was still a chance. If another ship had been nearby, if help had arrived sooner, perhaps dozens or even hundreds more people could have survived. But there was no help nearby, and within minutes the stern also vanished into the darkness. After that came the most terrifying part of the entire disaster. Because thousands of people ended up in the waters of the North Atlantic, the temperature of the water was about -2 degrees Celsius. In such conditions, a person can lose consciousness within only a few minutes. That is why most people did not die from drowning, but from hypothermia. Yet even within this tragedy, there were stories of incredible survival. People who clung to debris, people who were picked up by lifeboats, people who survived that night against all odds. And it is thanks to their testimonies that we know what happened during those final hours. But there is one more detail that makes this story even more remarkable. Because decades later, when researchers began studying the site of the disaster, they discovered not only the wreck of the ship, they found an entire underwater field of scattered objects. And those discoveries helped reconstruct the events of that night almost minute by minute. When explorer Robert Ballard finally discovered the wreck site of Titanic in 1985, he expected to see one thing: a massive ship lying on the bottom of the Atlantic, almost intact. Almost the same as when it disappeared beneath the water. But wait, because what the cameras of the deep-sea submersibles revealed was far stranger. The bow section really was lying on the seabed, enormous, dark, almost ghostly in the beams of the lights. But the stern was not beside it. It was nearly a kilometer away. That meant that when the ship broke apart and sank, its sections fell to the bottom separately, and between them lay something that researchers later called the debris field. Imagine a stretch of ocean floor several kilometers wide, and scattered across this entire area are thousands of objects. Suitcases, chairs, dishes, pieces of furniture, fragments of the hull, personal belongings of passengers. It looked like an underwater city suddenly frozen in time. But it was exactly these scattered objects that helped reconstruct the ship's final minutes. Because when Titanic broke apart and sank, everything inside began to burst outward. Lighter objects floated upward, and then slowly drifted down to the bottom. Heavier structures plunged downward much faster. And by studying the positions of these objects, researchers were able to understand how the ship disappeared beneath the water. But wait, because among these discoveries there were details that raised new questions. For example, the condition of the hull. Some sections looked heavily deformed, others appeared almost untouched. This suggested that the destruction happened in stages. First, the hull fractured. Then the ship's sections fell into the immense depth below, and that depth is nearly 4 kilometers. The pressure of the water at that depth is enormous. Imagine the weight of dozens of cars pressing on every square centimeter. Any hollow space inside the ship collapses instantly. That is why many rooms of the vessel were completely destroyed. Yet some objects were preserved surprisingly well. On the seabed, researchers found plates that were almost intact, bottles that had not shattered, even leather shoes belonging to passengers. These objects looked as if someone had carefully placed them on the ocean floor. And this is where one of the most powerful details of the entire story appears. Because every one of these objects is a reminder of the people who were on the ship that night. A suitcase, a watch, a pair of glasses, letters. All of them once belonged to someone who stood on the deck of Titanic and looked out over the cold water of the Atlantic. But there is another realization that researchers reached while studying the wreck site. The destruction of the ship is still continuing today. The metal is slowly being consumed by bacteria that feed on iron. Year after year, the structure becomes weaker. Some parts of the ship have already begun to collapse. And that means that one day, Titanic may disappear completely. Perhaps in a few decades, only a field of rust and scattered objects will remain on the seabed. But before that happens, researchers continue trying to answer one main question. What exactly made this disaster inevitable? Because when you put all the pieces together, the speed, the iceberg, the missing binoculars, the warnings, the design of the ship, one thing becomes clear. The sinking of Titanic was not caused by a single mistake. It was a chain of decisions. And sometimes it is exactly such chains that become the most dangerous. But there is one more detail that still sparks debate today. Because when we look at this disaster more than 100 years later, a question appears more and more often. Could it have been prevented? When you look at the story of Titanic as a whole, a strange feeling appears, as if the disaster did not happen because of one single event, not because of one iceberg, but because of a chain of decisions, each of which on its own did not look fatal. Yet together, they created the perfect conditions for tragedy. But wait, because if even one element of that chain had been different, everything might have ended differently. If the ship had been traveling just a little slower, if the iceberg had been spotted 1 minute earlier, if the binoculars had been there, if there had been more lifeboats on board, if the nearest ship had come to help sooner, each of these details alone seems small. But together, they determined the fate of more than 1,500 people. And that is why the Titanic disaster is often described as a perfect storm of human decisions. Because it brought together technology, confidence, mistakes, and chance. But wait, because this story has another layer. When Titanic was built, it was a symbol of a new era. Enormous ships, new technologies, fast transatlantic travel. People at the beginning of the 20th century believed that engineering could overcome almost any force of nature. Newspapers called Titanic practically unsinkable. That word appeared again and again, unsinkable. And that is why the disaster was such a shock, because in only a few hours, the ocean proved the opposite. But there is another paradox in this story. After the Titanic disaster, maritime safety rules changed almost immediately. International agreements began requiring enough lifeboats for all passengers. Radio stations were required to operate around the clock. Ships were ordered to monitor ice fields much more carefully. In other words, the tragedy of one ship changed safety at sea for the entire world. But wait, because even more than 100 years later, people continue to discuss this story. Films, books, research, new expeditions to the wreck site. Why? Because Titanic became something larger than just a ship. It became a symbol of human confidence in technology, a symbol of how quickly that confidence can collide with reality, and a symbol that even the largest and most powerful machines remain vulnerable to nature. But there is another reason this story still affects people today. Because when we look at the events of that night, one simple but powerful question appears. What would have happened if even one decision had been different? If the ship had been moving slightly slower, if the iceberg had been spotted a little earlier, if the nearest ship had arrived sooner, perhaps then Titanic today would simply be another old ocean liner in historical photographs, and not the most famous maritime disaster in the world. And that is why the story of Titanic remains a reminder even today. A reminder that sometimes the fate of enormous systems is decided by small details. And those are the details we tried to examine today, step by step. Because sometimes, the most famous disaster in history turns out to be not only a tragedy, but also a lesson. More than 100 years after the Titanic disaster, it seems that we know almost everything about this story. We know the date, we know the location, we know the speed of the ship, the moment of the collision, and even the temperature of the water that night. We know how many people were on board, and how many of them never returned home. But wait, because despite all the research, despite the expeditions to the wreck site and the thousands of pages of reports, one strange effect of this story still remains. The more you learn about Titanic, the more questions appear. For example, Why was the confidence in the ship's unsinkability so strong that the speed was barely reduced even after warnings about icebergs? Why did one of the largest ocean liners of its time sail into the ocean with a number of lifeboats that from the beginning was not enough for everyone on board? Why did the nearest ship that night not arrive in time, even though the signal rockets were seen on the horizon? And why some details of the events are still debated by historians, engineers, and researchers. But there is another reason why the story of Titanic does not disappear from people's memory, because it happened on the boundary between two eras. The beginning of the 20th century was a time of enormous faith in technology. People were building bigger, faster, and more powerful machines. Railroads crossed entire continents. Steamships connected nations. And it seemed that humanity had finally learned to control the world around it. Titanic was a symbol of that confidence. The largest ship of its time, the most luxurious, the most technologically advanced. But on the night of the 15th of April, 1912, that confidence collided with the reality of the ocean. And that is why the story of Titanic became so powerful. Because it reminds us of something simple. Even the greatest projects created by humans can remain vulnerable to the forces of nature. But there is another lesson in this story. After the disaster, the rules of maritime safety changed. New international agreements were created. Ships began carrying enough lifeboats for everyone on board. Radio stations began operating around the clock. Ice patrols started monitoring icebergs in the North Atlantic. In other words, the tragedy of one ship ultimately helped save thousands of lives in the future. And yet, when you look at photographs of Titanic standing in the harbor before its first voyage, a strange feeling appears. A massive ship, people on the decks, music, laughter, suitcases. None of them knew that in just a few days, their journey would become one of the most famous tragedies in the world. And perhaps that is why Titanic still moves people more than a century later. Because it is not just the story of a ship. It is the story of people, decisions, and the fragile line between confidence and reality. And it was on that line, in the cold waters of the Atlantic, that a ship once disappeared, a ship that had been believed impossible to sink. By the time Titanic was slowly lowering its bow beneath the water, something was happening on the bridge that many passengers did not even know about. The radio operators were still transmitting distress signals. At first, it was the new SOS signal, but they also used the older CQD signal that had been used before. Messages were sent into the air again and again. Coordinates, requests for help, words that meant only one thing: the ship was sinking. But wait, because in this part of the story, there is a detail that is rarely mentioned. Titanic's radio station was one of the most powerful at sea at that time. It could send signals hundreds of kilometers away, and that is why the message about the disaster was heard by several ships almost immediately. One of them was the passenger liner Carpathia. When the radio operator on Carpathia received the SOS signal, he at first could hardly believe it, because the name of the ship sounded almost impossible. Titanic, the newest and largest liner of its time. But the message kept repeating again and again. And then, the captain of Carpathia made a decision that would later be called one of the most heroic in maritime history. He ordered an immediate change of course, and headed toward the distress signal. But here, the problem of distance appears again. Carpathia was about 90 kilometers away from Titanic. For a ship at the beginning of the 20th century, that meant several hours of travel. The captain ordered the engines to increase to maximum speed. The machinery worked at its limit. Even the heating system on the ship was temporarily shut down, so that more steam could be directed to the engines. People on Carpathia began preparing everything they could: blankets, hot tea, medical assistance. But while the ship raced through the dark Atlantic, time for Titanic was already running out. The radio operators continued transmitting signals. Then the messages became shorter. At one point, one of the operators sent a calm but chilling sentence: "We are sinking." After that, the radio traffic began to fade. The last signals became weaker. And then there was silence. But wait, because help did arrive. When Carpathia finally reached the location of the disaster, the ocean was almost empty. The enormous ship was gone. On the water, there were only lifeboats and scattered pieces of wreckage. The people in the lifeboats saw the lights of the approaching ship and began shouting. It was Carpathia that lifted the surviving passengers out of the boats. In total, about 700 people were rescued. These were the people who survived one of the coldest nights in the history of seafaring. People who had drifted for hours among wreckage and freezing water. But even when the last survivors were safely on board Carpathia, one question had already begun spreading among sailors and journalists. Why did help come only from a ship that had been almost 100 kilometers away? Why did the ship, whose lights had been seen so close, never arrive? And that question became one of the most discussed after the disaster, because if help had arrived even 1 hour earlier, the story of that night might have looked very different. When the surviving passengers of Titanic arrived in New York aboard Carpathia, the world already knew about the disaster. Newspapers were printing enormous headlines. People gathered in ports and on city streets, waiting for the lists of survivors. Telegraph lines carried messages day and night. But almost immediately after the rescue, another process began the investigation, because too many questions remained unanswered. Why was the ship traveling so fast in an area filled with ice? Why did the warnings not lead to a change of course? Why were there not enough lifeboats? And why did the nearest ship that night never come to help? But wait, because the investigation began unusually quickly. The United States Senate called a special commission only a few days after the disaster. Witnesses were questioned almost as soon as they arrived in port. Captains, officers, radio operators, passengers, each of them had to describe what they had seen that night. But even then, it became clear that the picture of events would not be simple, because the testimonies often differed from one another. Some officers said the iceberg appeared suddenly. Others claimed that the evasive maneuver had almost succeeded. Some passengers said the ship broke in half. Others were certain that it sank in one piece. And here one of the main problems of any disaster investigation appears. People remember events differently, especially when the events happened during a night filled with panic, cold, and fear. But the commission tried to gather the facts. They examined radio messages, the testimonies of crew members, and the routes of other ships. Gradually, some answers began to appear. For example, it became clear that the maritime safety system of that time had serious weaknesses. Radio stations on ships were not operating around the clock. The number of lifeboats was determined by outdated regulations, and iceberg warnings were often transmitted without a strict system of control. But wait, because one conclusion of the investigation became especially controversial. The commission concluded that the main cause of the disaster was the collision with an iceberg at high speed. In other words, a combination of human confidence and natural danger. But some critics considered this explanation too simple, because it explained the catastrophe with a single cause, while many details pointed to an entire chain of factors. That is why, several years later, the British government conducted its own investigation. It confirmed many of the conclusions of the American Commission. But it added one more important point. The maritime industry had to change. And those changes did happen. After the Titanic disaster, new international safety rules were introduced. Ships were required to carry enough lifeboats for everyone on board. Radio stations had to operate 24 hours a day, and in the North Atlantic, a special ice patrol was created to monitor the movement of icebergs. In other words, the tragedy of one ship forced the entire world to change the rules of safety at sea. But even after all the investigations and reforms, one question still remained open. Because the more people studied this story, the more often they returned to the strange details of that night. The speed of the ship, the iceberg warnings, the missing binoculars, the ship on the horizon that never came. And it is these details that continue to make people return to the story of Titanic again and again. More than 100 years have passed since that night. You might think the story would have become just another chapter in textbooks, a date in the timeline of maritime disasters. But something different happened with Titanic. This story did not disappear. On the contrary, it only grew larger. With each decade came new research, new expeditions, and new questions. When the wreck of the ship was first discovered at a depth of nearly 4 kilometers, many people believed the mystery had finally been solved. Cameras showed the hull, the debris field, the broken sections of the ship. It seemed that everything had become clear. But wait, because sometimes new discoveries create more questions than answers. When researchers began studying the wreck site, they noticed details that had never been visible before. For example, how far apart the bow and stern sections of the ship lie, nearly a kilometer between them. That meant the destruction happened in a far more complex way than people had previously imagined. In addition, thousands of objects were found scattered across a vast area of the ocean floor. Suitcases, chairs, dishes, personal belongings of passengers. All of this formed a kind of map of the ship's final minutes. By studying where these objects landed, researchers could understand how the ship broke apart and fell to the bottom. But the most surprising detail was something else. Some objects were preserved almost perfectly. Bottles, plates, pieces of furniture. They rested on the seabed as if someone had carefully placed them there. It seemed almost unreal, considering the depth and the enormous pressure. And yet even these discoveries did not end the debates, because every new fact brought people back to that same night, to the decisions made on the bridge, to the iceberg warnings, to the ship on the horizon, and to the question that keeps being asked again and again. Could the disaster have been prevented? Some historians believe the answer is yes. If the speed had been lower, if the course had been changed earlier, if there had been enough lifeboats. Others believe the collision with the iceberg was almost unavoidable, because the conditions that night were simply too difficult. But there is one thing that nearly all researchers agree on. The sinking of Titanic became a lesson. After this disaster, maritime safety changed forever. New rules saved thousands of lives in the decades that followed. And yet Titanic remained something more than just a tragedy. It became a symbol of human confidence, a symbol of the technology of its time, and a reminder of how quickly even the greatest projects can collide with the reality of nature. But before finishing this story, there is one more question worth asking, because sometimes the most important lessons are hidden not only in the catastrophe itself, but in how people remember it. More than a century has passed. During that time, humanity has built ships many times larger. We fly across oceans in just a few hours. Satellites observe the entire planet. Technology has changed so dramatically that the world of the early 20th century now feels almost ancient. And yet the story of Titanic keeps returning again and again. Films, documentary investigations, books, expeditions to the wreck site. Why? After all, history has seen disasters with far greater numbers of victims. There have been ships that sank much faster. There have been tragedies that today almost no one remembers. But Titanic became an exception. But wait, because this story has a unique characteristic. It contains too many symbols: the largest ship of its time, the richest passengers, the most advanced technology, and the confidence that this ship was practically impossible to sink. All of it looked like proof that humanity had finally learned to control the ocean. But one single night shattered that confidence. And perhaps that is exactly why this story affected people so deeply. Because it happened at a moment when humanity was beginning to believe in its own invincibility. The early 20th century was a time of enormous hope. New machines, new cities, new technologies. It seemed that progress would only accelerate. But Titanic became a reminder that even the greatest projects remain vulnerable. And there is another reason this story has never disappeared. Because it is made up of hundreds of personal stories. People who set sail in search of a new life. Families moving to America. Millionaires traveling in luxurious cabins. Musicians who continued playing while the ship slowly sank beneath the water. These stories turn the Titanic disaster from a historical event into a human drama. But wait, because there is another layer to this story. The more researchers study the events of that night, the clearer one thing becomes. The disaster was not the result of a single mistake. It was the result of many decisions. The speed of the ship, the iceberg warnings, the missing binoculars, the lack of lifeboats, the ship on the horizon that never came in time. Each of these details alone does not appear fatal, but together they formed a chain that led to tragedy. And that is why Titanic remains such a powerful symbol. Because it reminds us of something simple. Sometimes, the fate of enormous systems is determined by small decisions, and sometimes those decisions are made within only a few minutes. But before we end this story, there is one more thing that must be said, because the lesson of Titanic turned out to be much larger than a maritime disaster. It changed the rules of safety, it changed the way people think about technology, and it left behind a question that still echoes today. What happens when human confidence collides with reality? And it is exactly that question that keeps the story of Titanic alive even more than 100 years later. When we look today at photographs of Titanic, standing in the harbor before its maiden voyage, it is hard to believe that the story would end in tragedy only a few days later. A massive ship, smoke rising from 4 funnels, people on the decks, music, laughter, suitcases. It looked like the beginning of a new era of travel. None of the passengers imagined that within days, their ship would become the most famous maritime disaster in history. But wait, because that is exactly the paradox of Titanic. Everything about this story looked perfect. A brand new liner, an experienced crew, the most advanced technology of its time, and yet a chain of decisions, coincidences, and circumstances led to the moment when, in the cold waters of the Atlantic, the ship believed to be practically unsinkable disappeared. When historians analyze the events of that night today, they often say the same thing. The Titanic disaster is an example of how several small factors can combine into one enormous problem. The speed of the ship, the late detection of the iceberg, the lack of lifeboats. Help that arrived too late. None of these factors alone guaranteed the loss of the ship, but together they created a situation from which there was no escape. And that is why this story remains so powerful even more than 100 years later. Because it reminds us how reality works. Massive systems can appear completely reliable. The most powerful technologies can look unbeatable. But sometimes a single chain of events is enough to change everything. And yet Titanic left behind more than just tragedy. It left a lesson. After this disaster, maritime safety rules changed. Ships began carrying enough lifeboats for all passengers. Radio stations started operating around the clock. Ice patrols were established to monitor icebergs in the Atlantic. In other words, the tragedy of one ship helped save thousands of lives in the future. But there is another reason Titanic remains part of our collective memory. Because this story is about people, about those who were on board that night, about families searching for a new life, about musicians who continued playing, about sailors who tried to save as many passengers as possible. These stories make the Titanic disaster more than just an event from the past. They make it part of human history, and that is why, more than a century later, people still return to that night in the North Atlantic. Because sometimes, a single story can tell much more than a fact about a ship. It can tell us about people, technology, and decisions that shape an entire era. Now, only one step remains to understand why this story still moves the world, and what the main conclusion is that we can draw from the tragedy that happened on that cold April night. So let's pause for a moment and look at the entire story as a whole. The largest ship of its time, the most advanced technology, the confidence of the engineers, the confidence of the passengers, the confidence of an entire era that humanity had finally learned how to control the ocean. But then came one cold night in the North Atlantic, an iceberg, just over 30 seconds to react. A maneuver that was meant to save the ship, but instead opened several compartments at once. A chain of decisions, speed, iceberg warnings, missing binoculars, not enough lifeboats, a ship on the horizon that never came in time. Each of these details alone does not seem fatal, but together, they created the perfect scenario for disaster. And that is why Titanic became more than just a ship. It became a symbol of human confidence in technology, a symbol of the moment when that confidence collided with reality. But wait, because this story has another layer. When Titanic sank, more than 1,500 people lost their lives. It was an enormous tragedy, but it was after that tragedy that the world changed the rules of safety at sea. International agreements were created. Ships began carrying enough lifeboats for everyone on board. Radio stations started operating around the clock. In the North Atlantic, an ice patrol was created, that still monitors icebergs today. In other words, the catastrophe of one ship changed maritime safety for the entire world. And that is the paradox of Titanic, because a tragedy that took so many lives also helped save thousands more in the future. But there is one more thing that makes this story special. Even more than a century later, people are still asking the same questions. Could the collision have been avoided? Why wasn't the speed reduced? Why didn't the nearest ship come to help? And why did the chain of decisions that night unfold exactly the way it did? Perhaps we will never know all the answers, but it is exactly those questions that keep the story of Titanic alive, because it reminds us of something simple. Even the greatest machines created by humans remain vulnerable to nature. And sometimes the fate of enormous systems is decided by small decisions made in just a few seconds. And that is why, more than a century later, the name Titanic is still heard all over the world. Not only as the name of a ship, but as a reminder of the night when human confidence collided with the cold reality of the ocean. There is one theory. If Titanic had not tried to turn, but had struck the iceberg head on, it might not have sunk. What do you think? Write in the comments.